It's never too late. How do I know? Because the very idea that I may one day get to share my family and my love of quilting with all of you beautiful people never even entered my mind. At least not for the first 5 decades of my life. Jenny. Chapter 1. Old Foundations and New Pathways. Once upon a time, every mother taught her daughters to sew. Not mine. My mother didn't know how to sew. Even my grandmother didn't know how to sew, yet I distinctly remember sewing at a very young age. I cut tiny pieces out of my mother's old clothing because I needed to make an outfit for my doll. I didn't know how clothes were made, so I put them together however I could. I glued them, stapled them, taped them. In fact, I can't remember a time in my whole life when I wasn't piecing things together. It was just in my DNA. Later on in life, I learned that my grandmother's older sisters sewed. They learned to sew from their mother, my great-grandmother, out of necessity in the late 1800s. And they sewed for their little sister, my grandmother, all the time because she was the youngest of 13 children. But some of my great-aunts did much more than sew for the family. As young women, they found work as seamstresses. And they weren't just your run-of-the-mill seamstresses. They were amazing seamstresses. And they sewed for an artist named George Innes, Jr. in New York. He was a famous painter whose father had been an even more famous painter of landscapes in the 1800s. And the work they did for him is part of what allowed the family to save enough money to buy a farm in upstate New York in the early 1900s. 6 of my grandmother's 13 siblings had moved to America from their home country of Sweden by then, and together they chipped in enough money to bring my grandmother and my great-grandmother, my great-grandfather, and the rest of the children to America on the Titanic. They booked tickets and steerage because, well, they were still poor people, but even so, can you imagine how excited they must have all been? In April of 1912, the family packed up all of their belongings and took a little boat from Sweden to England, where they took a train to Liverpool in order to board that mighty ship. But when they arrived, they found that the White Star Line had oversold the passage. "We don't have room for all of you," a crew member told my great-grandmother. "But let the boys go. They'll be making history." My great-grandmother wasn't having it. "Half of my children are already in America," she said. "I am not splitting up the rest of us. We will all go together, or none of us will go at all." So instead of crossing the Atlantic on the largest ship ever built, the family took a smaller ship called the Cedric, all the way to America. Who would have thought that taking a smaller ship would be safer than making a trip on the grandest ship on Earth? But as the world would soon learn, it was. And it's only thanks to that stubborn great-grandmother of mine that my family survived and is here today. My grandmother was 7 years old when they arrived in New York. 43 years later, after getting married and raising 2 daughters of her own, her husband, my grandfather, died at the age of 54. And that's what prompted Grandma to come and live with us. My mom, my dad, my older sister, my brother, and me in rural California, shortly after I was born in June of 1957. In those days, a woman in her 50s or 60s was obviously too old to live alone, so my parents set up a room for her in our house. At her age, she also no longer felt comfortable driving a car, but she wanted to work to pay her own way. So once a week, my parents made the nearly hour-long drive to Pebble Beach to drop her off at a house where she was a housekeeper for a nice man. When she was done, they drove back to Pebble Beach to bring her home and spend the weekends with us. That's when Grandma could be found in the kitchen cooking up something yummy for all of us to eat. All of us would eventually include my 2 younger sisters and another younger brother as well, but that wouldn't be until a few years later. I was lucky enough to be raised in a home where 2 Swedish women ruled the kitchen, and they both loved to cook. Everything was made from scratch. If we had breakfast, it might be Swedish pancakes or homemade jelly on fresh-baked toast or sweet-smelling cinnamon rolls. But it was often the dessert from the night before. During the week, my dad would get up to drive us to school at 7 a.m. and he would say, "Grab yourself a piece of cake," or whatever was left over. We had the dang best dessert breakfast ever. I loved using my hands and making things as a kid. I always wanted to help in the kitchen, but with both of them cooking, there just wasn't a place for me. I had to find another outlet. By the time I was 10 years old, it seemed like all kids were getting into 4-H, including my friend Annette. We used to spend our school lunch breaks reading Nancy Drew novels together. We didn't really even talk about them. We'd just sit together on the grass and read, and that was enough. Annette's mom, Mrs. Violini, happened to be a 4-H teacher, and she became one of my favorites. But it was another 4-H teacher, Mrs. Long, who first